All right, I think I'm going to get started a couple minutes early. We have so much ground to cover in such a short amount of time. And we've done a little practicing, and hopefully, did you want to do your...
Yep, real quick. I'm the volunteer host for the room, so I've been asked to remind you, while attending sessions, please keep in mind the Code of Conduct, the Charleston Library Conference Code of Conduct, which you can read on the conference website. And as far as questions go, they're going to be using a mic to speak. And instead of me running the mic around for questions, if you all say your question loudly, and then one of the panelists will just repeat it. That's it.
Thank you very much. And the Code of Conduct is real simple. It's be respectful, be kind. That's what we need to do to each other all the time. So thank you and good morning. I am David Hellman, and I am the Collection Development Coordinator at San Francisco State University's J. Paul Leonard Library, and the organizer and facilitator of this panel discussion, DEI for everyone, diversity, equity, and inclusion from the vendor's perspective. In 2020, the legislature of the state of California enacted an ethnic studies requirement for all 2- to 4-year public higher education institutions. This meant, for example, that every student from the California State University system needed to take an approved ethnic studies class to graduate. Subsequently, that meant students would need resources to support the requirement. Myself, as a member of the steering committee of the Shared Resources Digital Content Committee, or SRDC, I guess that's the real thing, I took it upon myself to work on behalf of the Systemwide Digital Library Content team, that's the consortial group for the CSU, at the CSU's Chancellor's office to see what DEI resources could be found that CSU libraries could potentially share. I put together an ad hoc DEI group, including 6 other librarians from the system, and between September and December of 2024, I met and negotiated with several different vendors. The DEI group reviewed over 24 resources and ultimately submitted a DEI resource recommendation to the Council of Library Directors for the CSU. I am happy to say that this recommendation was approved, and I want to thank in particular Leslie Kennedy of the Chancellor's office for securing the funding to acquire all the resources that my group had recommended, all of them. That was pretty amazing to me. Because of this process, all CSU students now have access to a DEI-focused database and 5 archival resources, all of us together, which is great. After this process, I was approached by EBSCO, who asked if I could arrange for them to talk to interested CSU librarians about their plans of developing DEI content going forward. That meeting was held and the program was well received. Out of a sense of fairness, I approached ProQuest about doing the same thing, and they enthusiastically agreed. It is from these efforts of vendors wanting to communicate with stakeholders about DEI that this panel was created. I am a firm believer in the value of DEI content and its potential to enhance higher education curriculum. As I stated in the abstract for this panel, DEI resources are in high demand for understanding and studying today's complex and variegated society. They are essential resources in supporting changing curriculum and providing students with a broad view of different cultures, outlooks, and experiences. I am pleased to have encountered vendors who also see that value and who are committed to developing resources that widen our perspective of the world around us. Rather than focusing on what librarians are doing with DEI, I thought it would be valuable to turn the tables for a change and ask vendors about DEI from their perspective. With that in mind, I would like to introduce the esteemed members of our panel. I also want to acknowledge right up front that we are not the most diverse panel in terms of representation, but I also think that's an issue we will discuss today. Our panelists are Kimberly Clarkson, Academic Product Manager, EBSCO, Seth Cayley, VP, Global Academic Product, Gale, and Nathalie Duval of Product Management, ProQuest, which is part of Clarivate. I also want to just give a quick shout out to Doug Way, who's the Dean of the University of Kentucky Libraries. Doug was really supportive in this process, and he contributed some of the questions. Before we get started, I want us to talk for a second about our format. The first question will be addressed to the panel, and each member will give a brief response. The following 3 questions will be directed at a particular member of the panel who will offer a full response, and after the others can chime in quickly. And the last question will be addressed to all the panelists who will respond briefly, and then I'll ask the audience to respond to that last question, and hopefully when we finish we'll have enough time for some question and answers. All right, we ready to go? So the first question, guys. How does the development of DEI resources align with your corporate mission? How have DEI initiatives changed your company internally? And I'd like to start with Kimberly.
Thank you. Let me know if the volume is not right on this. Thank you for the invitation to join this panel, firstly. And so I represent EBSCO, and as it relates to our products and to our content, we want to ensure that, you know, all histories are represented and the largest scope of perspectives available, both inside and outside of traditional scholarship. We seek primary sources to expand our knowledge base, and we want to provide credible content to all of our constituencies. As it relates to the company's corporate mission, we want to make sure that DEI touches every part of the company, and with measurable goals when possible. So, for example, in our technology department, they are working with partners in underserved communities to help develop a more diverse employee pipeline. Our marketing team has an assessment of internal and external images and messages to be inclusive, so our branding is as inclusive as possible. And our human resources group is working with some student committees for underserved students to potentially become interns. We also have some employee resource groups, and they're great. One of them is EBSCO Pride, which strives to create a more awareness and support for LGBTQ+ members at EBSCO. We also have Women at EIS, and that group creates mentoring opportunities. And Shalom EBSCO is a network for Jewish employees.
Natalie, would you like to respond?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. So our corporate mission relies on 3 pillars. Own your actions, aim for greatness, and of most importance, value every voice. All 3 align with the development of DEI initiatives, building trust and acting with integrity within communities and in our partnerships. Pursuing out to get content from underrepresented communities and historically silenced groups, representing every voice internally and in our products to respond to your needs and those of your patrons. What is most gratifying to us is the relationships we have built over time with librarians and faculty. We express our gratitude for making this rare content available digitally and what the development of these resources brings to their scholarship and teaching. So DEI content, like all other ProQuest content, follows the process of curation, digitization, and enrichment. So the materials are behind a paywall, but our partners are in agreement with this. They receive royalties that they can reinvest in their own program expansion. And more importantly, the often lesser known materials become widely disseminated, reaching a larger audience, which is a goal that we share. So internally, we've had many initiatives like EBSCO, with employee-led global networks encouraging diversity and inclusion around shared ideas and experience. We encourage staff to participate, to volunteer within communities. And Barb Olson, in the audience, led a cohort of group interviews with librarians on diversity initiatives and issues to better understand how we can support libraries better. In our team, diversity, equity, inclusion is at the core of everything we do, and we have a very diverse team in terms of origin, religion, etc. So that's something we're very supportive of.
And Seth?
Right. Thanks, Natalie. I'm I'm going to be the bad person who talks about money. So if you ever have the misfortune of reading business books, please don't. There's a phrase that you'll come across quite often, which is meet your customers where they are, not where you wish they were. And I say that because actually publishers such as particularly ProQuest and Gale have been publishing resources on DEI topics for years, going back to the microfilm days with UMI and primary source media. And full disclosure, they didn't sell. You know, we had microfilm resources on LGBTQ studies, women's studies, race relations. They were not the top performers in the microfilm days. That's, of course, completely changed in recent years, and that's because there are mandates and mission statements around DEI, there are budgets allocated, there are courses, there are a really enthusiastic faculty who are really promoting the use of DEI resources. And that's great because what we tried to do 20 years ago and failed to do is now being successful, and we are solving a customer need. And that's changed the way we work internally too. Everyone in my product team has a DEI-related goal, tailored to what they do within Gale. We've shifted our product strategy. If you look at the Gale Primary Sources publishing program, you'll see there's a dominance of DEI publishing, whether it's in sexuality issues, in race relations. We're moving into disability studies and other sort of adjacent topics. But even in our sort of core traditional database products, our aggregated journals, our sort of business products, we are making sure that we are surfacing DEI-related material that perhaps has been there all along, but has been completely invisible. So we're going back and we're enriching the metadata. We're making sure that African American-owned businesses are tagged as such, so you can search for them and filter for them. And then that's been a complete culture shift within Gale.
Thank you. So the next question is, DEI resources are in high demand and vendors are responding. Still, there are gaps to be filled regarding certain populations, language, identity, and particularly telling the story of the past through marginalized voices. What are you doing to fill these gaps, and what do you feel is one success story that you would like to share? And I'm going to have Nathalie take the lead on this question.
Yeah, thank you. So just like Steve said, ProQuest has been doing DEI resources for a very long time. We feel that it's part of our DNA. And just like you mentioned, with the microfilm, like in the 1990s, basically you had microfilm collection on the history of women at Gerritsen, at ProQuest, that it was really representing white women voices mainly. And so since then, we've really tried to get the voices, more diverse voices, and underrepresented groups. So that would be, for example, the women and social movement in modern empires, or women and development in the global south, to recent products. Another thing that we see some changes is the interest in native languages. 10, 15 years ago, it's okay? 10, 15 years ago, I remember that it had to be in English. Native languages were really not selling. And we've seen a change where there are requests for non-English materials. And so an example in French would be Le Monde, that has been doing very well, that we launched this year. We get a lot of requests for Asian American, Latinx content, indigenous content, LGBTQ, and we really try to address those needs. So we have, for example, a product on Queer Past, where we really have materials on Asian Americans and Latinx. So we are very aware that we need to further enhance our coverage beyond US and UK, which sometimes is really not that easy, because a lot of partners in non-English countries don't understand really the work of aggregators and digital collections. So to fill and identify the gaps, we rely a lot on our advisory board. We have many boards, including, but not only academic advisory board, but also librarians and archives. I find that the archivists are a great resource to uncover unique DEI content. So I think there was the success story. That was hard. There are a lot of products we are very proud of, but I want to highlight one, which is Disability in the Modern World, which is a multimedia collection that took tremendous effort. And the story behind. I've been wanting to do that collection for like 20 years and was trying to get the support from the business, and we eventually launched it a few years ago, and every single piece of content, the reason I'm proud of it, really took a lot of effort. And recently we are including right now content from Humanity and Inclusion, Handicap International. It's an organization that won the Nobel Prize for their anti-mine personnel work. And so I'm very proud to have managed to get this content, and it was a Choice Outstanding Academic title. So 20 years in the making, I'm very happy.
Seth, would you like to respond?
So, I mean, Natalie's answer was very comprehensive there. I mean, just to sort of elaborate on the point that Natalie made, the big demand that we're seeing is for materials from the colonised people themselves as opposed to the colonisers. You know, a lot of DEI resources over the years have been the view from the governing elites, their views of minorities. I mean, particularly true in sort of, say, African studies, where it's the colonial government's view of what was happening on the ground. But equally, government views of the AIDS crisis as opposed to the lived experience of people going through the HIV crisis in the 80s. So with that, our success stories, we've actually got an archive coming out next month on decolonization, looking at the sort of the independence movements in the 1960s and 1970s in sort of Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. And the reason that's a real success story is we've actually managed to find materials, pamphlets, ephemera, sort of secret leaflets, purely written by people leading the independence movements, as opposed to the British, French, German colonial governments trying to sort of clamp down on independence. Every material in this archive has been produced by the people who lived in those countries, both pre and post independence. It's a lot trickier to do than you think. These sorts of materials have, generally speaking, been lost. They are ephemeral for a reason. They were often destroyed when they were found by colonial governments. So when you've come across a treasure trove of materials like this, as a publisher, you get very excited.
Kimberly?
Thank you. So I think there are a few ways to answer this question, and one of them is from the user experience perspective. I think market feedback and user experience are critical to exposing and to filling the gaps. So the user experience team at EBSCO consistently hears researchers cite the need for research on vulnerable populations conducted by members of those groups. So research on communities, by communities. And we try to be very deliberate when we're recruiting for a user research study to make sure that our participants represent the full scope of the users of our products. So that's been a real priority at EBSCO. As far as the success story goes, on EBSCO's ethnic diversity source database, we have included publications from 38 Black-led and Black-founded publishers, and we were very excited about that, and that same sort of energy is being put into other products, and to really encourage our publishing partners to commit to diversity and inclusion, and to publish the content that represents the broadest pool of users.
Thank you. So the next question is for those catalogers and tech services people in the room. Classification and taxonomy offer challenges in terms of language and indexing that potentially harm marginalized groups. What kinds of reparative work are you doing to correct this in general, and especially in regards to DEI resources? And I'm going to ask Seth to take the lead on this.
Right. So, I mean, pretty much everyone in this room is probably some form of information professional. So I think we can probably all agree that classification and organisation of information is very, very important. Probably the one thing that binds us all together is we bring sense out of chaos for our members. But what is the sort of harm that classification can cause? I was trying to think of a good example. I'm going to think of one that's fairly close to home for me and my family, which is the history of sort of neurodiversity and autism. Many of you may not be aware, but autism was originally described as childhood schizophrenia for large parts of the 20th century. People with autism were sometimes described as idiot savants. And then even as sort of, recently as the sort of sort of the 2000s, high functioning, which is a phrase, autistic people, were described as having Asperger's syndrome. All of those phrases now are highly problematic, and if you're not sure why Asperger's is a problematic phrase, I encourage you to Google it. The point is, though, those terms now are potentially harmful to some, not all, autistic people. And that illustrates a point that we're in the business of classifying people. And at the best of times, classifying people is incredibly difficult because people are individuals, they're not groups, and individuals often defy classification. And historically, when we have been classifying people, it has been the people in power, the people outside that group who have been giving the classification, instead of the people who actually are given those labels. They're not choosing the labels for themselves. That's historically how classification has been done. It's been done by outsiders giving labels to people. And if you want the technical term, we've been using exonyms rather than endonyms. And to carry on with that, the shift that we've really done at Gale is we've moved now to using the labels that people themselves want to be called. So we've been moving more towards using endonyms rather than exonyms. And to give you a couple of examples of that to sort of make it real, many of you are probably aware there's been a move away from using the term slaves and moving towards enslaved persons. And that's because no one chooses to be a slave. Enslavement is a violence done to that person. So being a slave is not an identity. You have been enslaved. And so using that term enslaved person shows that an act of violence has been done. So we've moved to using that as the preferred term in our databases. It doesn't mean that if you use the word slave as a term, it won't bring up results. It's still there in the background. But the displayed term, the preferred term, is enslaved persons. Similarly, we've introduced a much richer LGBTQ search in our products. Previously it was somewhat binary, sort of gay, lesbian. Now we've got a range of sexualities and gender identities that you can search and filter on, particularly when you're doing person search in our more sort of biographical databases. It's not perfect, and it's still incredibly challenging because people are people and they defy classification. Not everyone likes the term queer. Queer has sort of been adopted by many in the LGBTQ community, but there's a whole generation, particularly of older gay men, who consider it still a slur and do not like its use. So what do you do about that? The term Latinx, widely used, we've already used it, very popular in academic and sort of commentariat circles. You actually do a sort of survey of many Hispanic Americans. They've not even heard of the term, or they don't use it. I think the last statistic I saw was about 3% of Hispanic Americans use the term Latinx. So is that the right term to use? And then finally, in my home country of the UK, we have an initialism called BAME for Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. It's sort of equivalent to BIPOC as used here. Very, very popular in newspapers, used in government papers. Absolutely no one on the street uses BAME as an initialism. So do we use it? These are sort of the unanswered questions that will continue to evolve, because what you should do is use the terms that people themselves want to be called, and that will change over time.
Thank you. Kimberly, would you like to respond?
Sure. So taxonomy and subject indexing are ways that we can better expose marginalized groups. At EBSCO, when we think of reparative work, we think of inclusion and characterization of topics, individuals, businesses and organizations, media titles, geographics and locations, and we sort of, we look for historically marginalized groups. We create a new taxonomic label, and we search for content to apply it to. And then we go back a couple years to ensure representation. And it's hard because certain terms or a certain language are still being used to describe specific groups. Things evolve, they don't happen, they don't change overnight. And so we really put a concerted effort into sort of finding relevant content and applying that new label. And we're aware of the risks of our own biases. So with subject indexing, we seek third-party resources, sort of keep us honest and expose the gaps in our coverage. About a year ago, we sought the top 100 companies as defined by Black Enterprise magazine. And we discovered that we didn't have some of them in our vocabulary. And, you know, we're not proud of that, but it's an example of being intentional and sort of owning and correcting the mistakes as we go forward.
Natalie?
Sure, thank you. So I wanted to really respond to sales because we actually have a few products that use queer. One of them is queer-based, and this really came from our academic editors, Lisa Stein and Lisa Relano, that felt that that term really was very inclusive with disability. They see it as a broad term, and so we had a lot of discussion around that, and we decided to do that. Similarly, we are about to release a Latinx certain culture collection, and we work very closely with NPR. So it's bringing two programs from the 1970s and 1980s that were focused on Latinx, so like Enfoque Nacional, Latin Files. And the reason was I read a lot about the issue with Latinx, but looking at the current landscape, the associations, or they are rebranding themselves, Library of Congress use of terms, and actually the academic themselves from the community who are writing books. There is a book that was published on NPR, The Sound of Exclusion, and so we followed those guidelines. But there is a lot of internet debates around those choices. Similarly, we talked about classification, and we did recently classify women in publishing in early modern books. It felt very important because the women were very often hidden, using even sometimes names. So we got some pushback that we were categorizing. Because it is so historical, not about living people, it feels like it's very important to bring back that. In terms of indexing, our indexing team is constantly reviewing terms to make sure that that our choice is non-discriminatory. So I can give a few examples of recent terms that seem awful that they were before, like aliens. I was a resident alien for a long time. That was changed to non-citizens once the Biden administration changed the term for government. We also, well, again, like working in LGBT in the early 2000s, LGBT was the terms. So we had progress gay and lesbian literature, for example, and it's been changed to LGBTQ literature. In 2021, we also added critical theory and critical race theory and racial justice. So it's a constant reappraisal of the terms we are assigning to our content.
Thank you. And now we have the big sort of self-reflective question. What are vendors doing to combat systemic racism in publishing? And what are the main challenges vendors and publishers face in developing DEI resources? And I'm going to ask Kimberly to take the lead on this.
Yeah, thanks. So, okay. So it's a big question. The social justice movements and the disparities revealed by the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd in 2020 sort of cast a spotlight on systemic inequalities. And that has sort of led to a renewed interest from many of our customers, who are mostly librarians, in DEI efforts. And EBSCO, you know, we're not a publisher, so we don't have a role in selecting manuscripts and publishing works. However, as an aggregator, our role is to bring together the sort of the world's best quality educational literature and allow it to be accessible through discovery. And perhaps our biggest role in combating systemic racism is through our sort of rigorous curation process and deciding what to index and what not to index. So we're committed to providing the most diversified collection of content, you know, that we can, working with what's out there now. And we, in addition to identifying sort of quality materials for inclusion, our curation process also involves research to identify publications that are deliberately racist, even when they claim to be peer-reviewed. An example of this would be Mankind Quarterly, which sort of believes in scientific racism and is a promoter, largely recognized as a promoter of white supremacist pseudoscience. And so we don't index that journal, and we never will. As far as challenges go, in trying to be as inclusive as possible, it's not always easy to just go out and get the content and stick it in a database. In the past, when we've tried to pursue publications from indigenous publishers, as an example, it's historically been difficult. There are good, rich archives of tribal newspapers that live in libraries throughout the country, and the rights holders are unclear, and rights become a blocker when you're trying to license content. So that's one area that's been challenging for us. Another is, from time to time, we are navigating a little resistance to diversity and inclusion. And normally when that happens, it's because a public library or a public university is required to follow local policy. And finally, I'd say most research products, EBSCO included, sort of lack the tools to surface work by Black and LGBTQ+ authors. And so we want to ensure that research can be done and users can find authoritative content by author characteristic when that's important to do so along the research path. So we're exploring some creative ways of making that happen when an author has chosen to self-ID.
Seth, would you like to respond?
Sure. So Kimberly's talked about sort of the output of publishing. I'm going to talk about sort of the publishing industry itself, because to combat systemic racism, you've got to be an anti-racist organisation. So how do you sort of create a publishing company that feels inclusive, that people think that they can apply for jobs at, and also be successful at? That really sort of comes down to sort of focusing on belonging in a sense of community. How do you take care of your staff? So some of that is about creating those employee resource groups. Kimberly mentioned they have at EBSCO as well. So we have a pride group. We have a group it's called Mosaic that sort of focuses on sort of ethnic minorities. We have employee resource groups on sort of working parents, mental health. And these are all run by employees themselves, but they're able to bring visibility to those issues. They're able to advocate for those issues in the workplace. They get attention at our sort of weekly all-company sort of Zoom calls. They brought a lot of visibility to just the sheer diversity that already exists within Gale and our parent company, Cengage. And we as line managers, we are expected to let our employees spend time on those employee resource groups. They are as important as sort of the day-to-day job. It's also about who we work with. As a company that is involved in digitalization, creating XML and indexing, we work with a variety of suppliers. We've got active projects at the moment to make sure that we're working with as diverse as group as possible of our suppliers, rather than just going back to the same groups that we've been working with for many years. There are challenges. I posted a job recently, and we had 130 applicants, and to the best of our knowledge, they were all white people. And we were actively looking for sort of to bring more diversity to the editorial team. We realised our mistake was that we went to the usual places where we post jobs. We were still going to the same agencies. We were still relying on our HR team. We were relying a little bit on LinkedIn. You've got to be much more active. So we reposted the role, and the whole team sort of researched different places where we could get the attention for where we could post this role. On the plus side, the pandemic has actually been really helpful for this, because Gale US is headquartered in Michigan, and prior to the pandemic, pretty much every US role we hired in Michigan. But since the move to remote working, I've actually got a number of colleagues in the room here who've been hired during the pandemic, but also elsewhere. And we're hiring people all over the States, all over the world. We've hired a director of discovery at the moment who's Peruvian, who studied in Switzerland, who's now currently based in the UK. We would never have done that before. But the shift to remote working has really opened up the ways in which we can recruit.
Anthony.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, just similarly, last week I was looking at our corporate website, and there was an invitation to join race and ethnicity group, and you could like join at different levels, volunteer a few hours, or volunteer several hours a week or several hours a month. So it was really great to see this, and we have members of our team. So the diversity collection, for example, is managed by a woman of color, and she brings a lot of different perspectives to this collection. It was very important for me that she would be responsible for this. So another way we've done, and it's more about content, so Kimberly talked about the murder of George Floyd, and right at that time we created a free resource. It's the Black Freedom website, and really there was a way to combat systemic racism by providing access to resources on the Black experience in America. So another way for us to address the issue is to really create a more inclusive board. So recently launched Progress Black Studies, we invited several members to work on it, and it was really a great experience. We have LGBTQ plus boards, and someone told me, and it's really, it was about, what about your other boards, like non-DEI? And so we're really trying to create boards that are diverse, not only for DEI as a rule moving forward. In terms of challenges, I mean, there is the challenges with getting contemporary resources, in primary sources especially. There are rights issues, there are also privacy issues we have to be very aware of, and so we're very careful with that. The other thing that sometimes, for us, bringing the primary sources, representing communities is very important, but as a corporation, it can be challenging. Some institutions are reluctant to work with us, and it makes it difficult to represent as much as we want the different communities.
Thank you. I just want to acknowledge the issue exists in librarianship itself. So it's everyone's problem and something to deal with. And if you want to know something about the history of systemic racism, Google the name of the person this room is named after. I'll just leave it at that. Look up Pinckney sometime. It'll kind of blow your mind. We have one last question. We have about 6 minutes. I want to let everybody know, I think we can run over a few minutes to get some Q&A in. So if people want to hang out, that's fine. I understand if people need to take off. I want to cover this last question pretty quickly. Then I'm going to extend this question to those of you who would like to respond to it. And then if we have any more time, we'll do some Q&A, okay? So our final question is, and I want to thank everybody on the panel. It's been great working with you. What do you see as the role of libraries in the development of DEI resources? How can libraries and vendors collaborate to better meet the needs and expectations of users? And I'd like to start this with Seth.
So publishers are customer driven. We solve customer problems or we perish. So what I would say is, if we're not satisfying, your needs in terms of DEI resources, and goodness knows publishers make mistakes all the time in terms of not, hitting the mark. I encourage you to really, really advocate strongly and let us know, rather than complaining that we're getting it wrong within the community. Tell us to our faces, we can take it. Advocate for what you want. Join advisory groups. Get paid. We do pay for advisors. We don't expect unpaid input. Provide feedback. Speak to your rep. Actually, the best way we often hear product feedback or things about what we should be doing is through our account managers, because they are the front line. They speak with you more regularly than anyone in product teams does. Maybe they should speak to customers more frequently. But that feedback does come through. So if we're getting things wrong, let us know about it. We can change.
Great. Natalie, would you like to take it now?
Yeah, sure. So I think library can play a critical role in helping surface the DEI content that we come from, all of us. They can also encourage all disciplines to incorporate and revise learning objectives that engage with DEI. There are great examples, and I can forward the link at Carnegie Mellon University. So we already collaborate with libraries, I think, about for the digitization of archive. It is often a very lengthy process, and I think I said that before, but a deeper acceptance of commercial projects could be beneficial. Many collections remain inaccessible in the confines of the archive, so there are models to be explored with mixing open and non-open access content. There is a session later today on Historians and Librarians Unite. It is part of a Women and Social Movement project, and as part of this, there was a crowdsourced project called the Online Biographical Dictionary of Women Suffragists in America, and that was a good example of collaboration, and there could be more projects like this. I do find that there is a lot of local history to be done too, and reflecting local communities. Libraries can play a very unique role in that and are a great channel. Finally, I will echo what Seth said, that talking, we have a great specialist in the room, and she brings back a lot of feedback for us, and we really take it into account in the development of new projects. So I think this ongoing dialogue is essential to us and between vendors and libraries. So.
Kimberly, would you like to finish this for us?
Sure. So similar to what Seth said, most of what we do as a company revolves around the idea of creating solutions to challenges that librarians face. Not only do we employ many librarians who are collection development experts and culturally focused, but we have mechanisms, we have feedback loops and advisory boards, user research. We have ways to garner this direct feedback from librarians, and it's more important than ever now as it relates to DEI needs. Librarians have a direct line to their faculty, a need to elevate their programs, and we want to help address the difficulties with, as it relates to some subject matter in their collections. So it's really the combination of, I think, the dedicated staff at EBSCO and the experience that all of these librarians have that comes together to make the greatest impact. And we also, so beyond this, we're involved in supporting larger studies that will shed light and provide insight toward other collective goals. A timely example of this is a study from Ithaca SNR that EBSCO has supported, which will sort of provide guidance on leading by diversifying collections. And as I understand it, that should be published any day now.
I wanted, before I open it to audience, I want to make a point that I made this deliberately low tech, so you can always find our emails and our names. We're easy enough to find out. I dedicate that sentiment to Rick Burke, the retired former director of Skelk, who always said he hated PowerPoints, not another PowerPoint. So Rick, that's for you. Would anybody like to respond to this question, or do you have other questions? You can shout them out and we'll relay them over the microphone here. What are you guys doing about the people, the librarians out there? What do you want to see more of? And how can we collaborate with our vendors better? Please.
My colleague and I are current university California Davis, and we are actively involved in diversifying, making efforts, taking steps, baby steps to diversify our collection. But it is such an amorphous topic, and there's no spreadsheet or grid or anything of materials. And one of the things that I was really curious about is, this idea of identifying publishers that are underrepresentedly owned and that publish materials from that particular group. I mean, that's something that we're very interested in, and yet it's very difficult to corral that information. We're finding it challenging to take steps in this process.
Yeah, I want to note that, I don't know if Laura's still here, I know that that ProQuest has been making some efforts in that direction to try to pin down specifically underrepresented publishers. I still think, I'll be a little critical here, I think there's more work for them to do on that to really get to what we need as librarians. As part of that recommendation process, we actually, one of the big things that was missing is ebooks that we didn't really cover. And that's a huge challenge in sort of building DEIA collections, again, that we could share collectively. But I give ProQuest some credit for sort of taking, at least leading in that direction. And I'd love to see where you do more of it. So you can always talk to Lauren about that. Yes, sir.
This is more just a comment in general. I think one of the challenges for libraries is not only just the quantification of diversity, and I hate using that term because I find it's very problematic, but I think a bigger issue just realistically, is priorities and budgets. Because I love all these products, and I have interest in a lot of these products, but they're not open products. They're products for purchase and so on. So as libraries, we need to really think hard about where, with finite budgets, and sometimes look, budgets that are going down in a lot of cases, where we want to divest and where we want to invest. And if we're really serious about some of these folks, we need to really think seriously about, investing in these kind of products and partnering and helping to create these products, because rights is an issue always and so forth. I also want to encourage vendors at the same time to think of ways to work with libraries, either in consortial or bigger agreements for libraries who can't afford these materials, and for us to think of ways to possibly have, I don't call it read and publish kind of deals or something like that, or EBA kind of plans I know are out there too, kind of for those kind of products. But for us to really think hard about how we create that inequity for those populations that are not able to purchase that for their users who will benefit just as much as the big libraries. I work at Emory. We have a pretty sizable budget, but there are many I can't purchase even at an R1 university level that I am. So I think libraries have a lot of work to do in terms of working with administration and so forth about where to put their money, where they're, walk the walk and walk the talk, that kind of stuff is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I want to say this was part of the DEI initiative I did in this CSU was along those lines, and a big and important part of it was, and one of the pushbacks I got from some campuses was, well, we already have those products. I had half of the things that we picked up. It was about equity across the system. Mm-hmm. Now that there's campuses like Bakersfield that don't have that budget for one-time purchases. And I really had to argue the point. This is for all of us. We need to do this collectively. So I think a consortial approach where people are open to equity and sort of like, well, I don't necessarily get this bone this time, but 6 other campuses that can't afford it, they have it now. So that's really important. I think the other important thing to add to your question is, this is a real hot topic now. What happens when it gets forgotten tomorrow? This is something, DEI is something I strongly believe needs to be perpetuated. It can't just be sort of the buzzword of today, and it's like, yeah, we're going to crowd the field with resources, and then again, they sort of fall, you can continue doing that, but they sort of fall by the wayside. I think it's something to keep the focus on. That's why I want to do the panel here. We have maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions real quick. Yes, please.
I recognize the majority of the people in this room are from universities and colleges, but I'm working at a 9th through 12th grade prep school where the majority of our kids go to your places, just so you know. And they all want to use the resources, right? So we have kids that would, if we start using some of your resources and they're priced appropriately for our budgets, they would be able to use them there and then say, oh, when I go to UC Davis or when I go to Yale or whatever, they are going to recognize the fact that, oh, I used that when I was at my school. So I think it's something that it's important to sort of keep that in mind, because this is permeating into the 9th through 12th grade market. This DEI, there's a lot of states that aren't restricting. They're actually moving forward and demanding that there are race studies in 9th through 12th grade schools. And it's important that a lot of those things are sort of, happening right now. So I just wanted to all keep that in mind as well.
You also pointed out the other elephant in the room, kind of, with that resistance and pushback.
Oh, yeah.
Against,
a lot of our peers
DEI.
in the independent school world are having pushback from parents and other places. Luckily, right now, we are not in the zone that we are in, but that is definitely happening.
I have a school board member in Fremont, Northern California, where I live, who's running against a really experienced, a great school board member, and her whole agenda is empowering parents. And that's, we all know, that's code, right? That's code for getting rid of librarians, cleaning up the curriculum so there's nothing in it that challenges, that's all it's asking, is challenges people to think about the world differently. That's it. One last question, and then we're done. Tucker, do you allow? Yes.
Well, I'm from the UK, like Steph. One of the barriers, if we look around about diversity, you just look around in this room, and one of the challenges we have is that people, like Steph said, aren't applying to our industries. There's a barrier because they don't actually know what publishing is about, or certainly why aren't people applying from different backgrounds. And I wondered whether you had any outreach programs for younger generations, almost like the K-12 sector, to try and kind of dispel the myth of what it is to work in publishing or work in a library, because people aren't applying. We will run the same people, we'll re-employ the same people, the same demographic, and the same type of people that we always see. And unless we change that fundamental kind of reason for people to not apply and work out how we can make it more democratic. And I just wondered if you had any programs that you were putting in place here in the UK that was trying to dispel a myth of why we're not getting more diverse people applying in our industry.
I believe I'm supposed to repeat the question. So it's, are vendors doing outreach programs to encourage a wider diversity of applicants to the publishing industry? So the short answer, certainly speaking for Gail, is no, we don't have such programs, but it is the problem that we have identified in the last 18 months, I would say, and so potentially an outreach program could be one of the planks to solving that. The other challenge we have, and I don't know if this is true with Clarivate and EBSCO, but we don't have much turnover at Gale. I mean, the average tenure of a Gale employee is about 25 years.
Wow.
So it actually makes it quite difficult to turn over sort of the makeup of your staff without creating new roles, essentially, or doing fairly sort of brutal reorganisation. So, which, we're a corporate company, we're not unknown to do it. But that's the other challenge we're dealing with here, and I imagine that's not dissimilar to libraries as well, where the length of tenure is.
I think one thing I'll add for libraries is I think mentorship is really being very proactive about that as well. And I think another thing that's important is every search committee I've ever been on, always the highest standards on experience. Well, experience, evaluating people by experience isn't necessarily the equitable way of going about it. So finding a more diverse candidate who maybe they're a level lower in experience, but they bring a different perspective to your faculty, I think that's something to take into consideration when you make your choices. So I think that's really important. And I'm just saying, experience tends to go with people who look like me, right? I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've got the experience, but I've had all sorts of advantages in my life that others haven't. So I think recognizing that in librarianship makes a huge difference. And I'm saying, let's just get the most experienced candidate. Experience is a really loaded term,
If I could add to that too. So at EBSCO, this is hugely important. And I'm not an HR specialist, so I can't get into the nitty-gritty details, but it is their mission, and they are committed to creating a more diverse candidate pool. And we do work with a program that brings in interns from an underserved community. So we have that. They've changed all the places where job listings are posted to attract a more diverse pool of candidates. The vice president of our HR department is amazing. Her work is just incredible, and she is set on bringing in more diverse employees to EBSCO, and so this is really, really important to us.
To us too, and it's an important part also is part of that dialogue, like, when we have faculty and they bring students to publishing, we had internships as well where we had diverse representation, and that's another way for us to keep the pulse and encourage graduate students. We're like, there is a nice career you can do in publishing that is very exciting.
Yeah, I want to acknowledge again, and no one gives, you just ask the vendors out there, David Hellman. I see that. I really want to acknowledge and credit the vendors. I've seen proactive changes in the sort of face that I see coming to me to have a meeting. And I think that's fantastic, and that's great. So, thank you, everybody. Did you have a quick question?
I just wanted to comment that it's going to take maybe a year of your time to pass on what you know to someone from an underserved community. But somebody did it to me when I came into the business, so I like to share that with other people. So it's going to take a year maybe, so it'll be a slow year. Team building.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's been great.